Modern China is really viewed through the lens of Mao. And when I say Mao, I mean Mao Zedong, who is the leader that brings communism to China. And what is Mao's background? Well, first, I think we have to sort of talk about what originally happened to China, right, as far as their political structure. So China had been ruled by emperors, and we talked about the idea of being granted leadership through Tian or heaven, and then having these rulers that were part of dynasties. So the emperors would be part of a larger dynasty, and they would rule over the people. This goes along in Chinese history, really from Qin all the way up to the last emperor when the Republican Revolution occurs. The Republican Revolution happens in the beginning of the 20th century, 1911, and sought to demolish the imperial system. The argument being that one person should not rule over the masses. This was inspired by, of course, Marxism. Marxism, as a political philosophy, basically argues that the masses should rule themselves, right? That power should be to the people, that the everyday man, right, should be in charge of themselves, essentially. And the philosophy of Marxism says, the workers should unite, the people should, rule. And this inspires, right, the Republican Revolution, the overthrow of the imperial system under the auspices of, or the idea of collective action, right, or collective rule. We'll talk a little bit about how communism in China is a perversion of Marxism. So if you've actually studied Marx as a political philosopher, you know that the kind of totalitarianism that Chinese communism becomes is not what Marx was talking about. Marx felt very strongly that, again, people should rule, right? The individual should have agency. They should achieve praxis, right, or fulfillment. That the worker should be the mechanism of the government. If you know Chinese communism, you know that basically it becomes a totalitarian state where they throw out one set of rulers essentially, but Mao, in a sense, rises to become a ruler in his own right. And so one of the critiques that Marxism often encounters is its motives are pure, but the way that it is applied and usually acts out when people actually try to use Marxism as a way to create government is that bad actors will fill any vacuum. Bad actors will show up in any situation. For some reason, that people like to be ruled, right? Or you could argue that people who want power can't resist taking it. So, unfortunately for Marx, his philosophy is often looked at as much as a utopia, right, in a sense, because we've seen in practice that it can't really work very well half the time. It doesn't really work. So, again, if you know Marxism, you know that he would not think that communist China is a reflection of his values. So basically, after the Republican Revolution, Mao, right, rises to power, right, and becomes sort of the leader in the People's Republic of China, as we say. And this is established in 1949. He gains power and then creates the Cultural Revolution that he's most famous for, which lasts from 1966 to 1976. And what are, right, Mao's values, essentially? His values are very much, related to the idea of equality with no class structure and the will of the state, as we might say. And this is why I always joke, this is where he starts to veer away from what Marx was talking about, because you can't have equality of the masses with someone in charge. That's not really how it works. That's when you become a totalitarian government, as we say. So he takes Marx philosophy but twists it, as much as we see as like Stalinist Russia. It just isn't what Marx is really talking about. But what Mao and Stalin and these kind of totalitarians thought in their mind is that they were speaking about prosperity for all. They sort of had this warped idea of equality with no class structure. And the way that they tried to move people to this equal structure, as they put it, is by demeaning or undermining everything that came before. So if you notice, when you talk to someone about Mao or Stalin and what they believed in, they basically said, anything traditional had to go. Traditional culture, traditional religion, traditional architecture, traditional art, that was all to be feared because it was the past. And by cutting people from the past, they felt that they could have a fresh start and, in a sense, have control over them. And they tried to preach this idea that religion was delusional, it was poisonous, it distracted you from the will of the state, the good of what China needed. And so, trying to tell people basically Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, these were all old, outmoded ways of thinking, that your religious thought should go to the state. So you'll notice that they rip away anything traditional and say it's poisonous and dangerous and is going to distract you. But Mao, the whole time, I would say, was really crafty about how he used propaganda. His propaganda was always presenting him as someone approachable, a man of the people, even while we know he was a very dangerous individual. Here he's shown as a peasant, right? A man of his people, right? And in a sense, it's presented in a way where people think he's approachable, he's likable, right? He's understandable. And the reason I love studying Mao is because I love propaganda, right? I love how people use it to create the society that they want. And Mao was one of the best you would ever run into. How did he float his ideas, right? He basically published a book. He published a book called Quotations from Chairman Mao, or as it's now most commonly known, the Little Red Book. And it laid out his philosophy, his quotations, his ideas, his thoughts about basically, how the classes should be honored. In his ideology, it was always praising the idea of the worker, the peasant, and the soldier, the three types of people. Notice who's left out here. Notice that there are no government officials that are being praised. There's no aristocracy that's being praised. And there's no academics that are being praised. He's praising the common man. So during the time of the Cultural Revolution, there actually was a purging of most of these kind of people. So if you were an academic, woe to be me during this time, because I probably would have been purged. Because I would have been looked at as being dissident. I would have been looked at as not reflecting the values of the common man. I'd be too elite, right? Too academic, right? I couldn't possibly understand the real people and the real people's needs. So notice who's not being praised in this ideology. Notice who's not being promoted. And he's looking at the common people, the worker, the peasant, the soldier. And, it's to be really noted that his Cultural Revolution reshaped the face of China. If you lose 2 to 5 million people, and consider the fact that I don't know the exact number, no one knows the exact number, that if 2 to 5 million people are purged, that's a nice way of saying killed, by the way, that you completely reshape the intellectual framework, the ideological framework, the political framework of your country. And if you look at the piece of art I'm showing you here, notice it's all about propaganda. It's these people who are in a village. They look like common everyday folk. And they're sitting around talking. And the person talking, you'll notice he has a little red book to his side. And I'm sure what he's saying is, Mao is our champion. Mao is who we should follow. All hail to dear leader, essentially, who will see us forward. It's brainwashing. It's propaganda. When I did my master's thesis, I did most of my work on what this artwork is. It's government propaganda. We often refer to it as social realism, and we'll talk about that term in a minute. It's really meant, to get into someone's head, to show them through visuals what is expected of them or what the new world order should be. And here's one of the quotes from Chairman Mao, right? Turn the old world upside down, smash it to pieces, pulverize it, create chaos, and make a tremendous mess. The bigger, the better. Mao believed very strongly that you used art to brainwash. I mean, the nicer way to put it is you use propaganda to inform and educate. But again, it's where you stand, right? Whether you view it as a good message or a brainwashing message. I'm sure that the workers were like, well, power to us. And the academics were like, well, what did we do, right? We didn't do anything. But again, I always joke it's where you stand. And for him, he felt that if you tore all the old structures down, that all you have is a blank canvas, right, to write on from that point forward. And as I mentioned, the what we call the Cultural Revolution, the full name of it is the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, because the proletariat is the everyday person. It purged the country of traditional culture and also of capitalist tendencies. The idea was that you would erase these two things, and then only the Marxist communist message could remain. And what you find is that traditional artists, they know that they're under fire. Academics know that they're under fire. So what they typically would do was change what they were doing to fit this new mentality. So if you were a painter, let's say, you would start to paint things where maybe you use the old style of landscape painting. Remember those beautiful pieces, ink on paper, these beautiful landscapes. Go back and look at Shen Chao and Shatao and those artists. Um, this looks just like that until you realize that you're seeing, power lines and bridges and industry and technology all littering through the painting. Academics would stop talking about, imperialist culture and start talking about communist culture. So if you wanted to live, right, you realized that you needed to change what you were doing, right, to stay under Mao's radar, so you wouldn't get purged, you wouldn't get killed, and you'd fit right in. So as I mentioned, the art of Mao revolves around the artistic style we call social realism. So we'll talk about that here in a minute.